So people start to switch over to precious metals, gemstones, things that are rare. And at this point, trade is starting to become a lot more abstract. When it was at the barter stage, it's very concrete. I have a thing that you want, you have a thing that I want, and by swapping with each other, we're both better off. That's as real as it gets. Then they developed the commodity currency. I have a thing that you may or may not want right now, but you probably know somebody who wants it, so we can swap. It's still grounded in reality because it's a product that has inherent merit. But once you start to move towards specie, things get very abstract. You want my metal, but to do what with it? To buy other things. Why do they want your metal? Because they believe other people will want it. Trade begins to become unmoored from the reality of consumption. These metals, they had use in decoration. They had some use in, metallurgy, but they're very normal and luxury goods. I think pretty much everybody would agree with that. Gold is a luxury good. Gold is a normal good. You don't buy gold plated, you know, dinnerware unless you're a rich man. So it had use, but its use was very, very narrow in scope. And so this initially made it a little unattractive as means of exchange. But what it did have over commodities was that it had a much more stable supply. Gold and silver are rare. In order to find more of it, you have to go prospecting. Usually people don't succeed. Even when you do find it, you still have to mine it out of the ground. It's costly, very costly to extract it. And this meant that for the most part, there would be no wild positive or negative supply shocks. And at the same time, because gold and silver was only used as a commodity by a small portion of the population, because it was such a small part of most people's lives, that also protected it from positive and negative demand shocks. Moreover, specie was also highly compact, which made it easy to carry and move. In the movies, you'll often see people, movies, video games, whatever, you'll often see people running around with bags full of gold coins. They go in the tavern, they slam down that gold coin on the counter to buy a drink. People didn't do that in real life. That gold coin might be worth like a month of wages first. What people would do is they would actually carry, say, bags of dust. Like a prospector walks into the saloon with his dust bag and he pours out just the slightest amount of gold dust to pay for his drink. Somebody needs to buy groceries. You get out a knife and you cut off a sliver of the coin to make your payment. Back in those days, destroying currency was not a crime. People expected to do this. That's where pieces of eight come from. In your pirate stories, everybody knows, the pirates, they want doubloons and pieces of eight. A piece of eight was 1/8 of a coin. You would take a coin and you would cut it up into equal parts, like a pizza pie. And then because they're equally sized, you know how much it's worth. And people would pay with that. They'd pay with a chunk of a coin. Well, this might sound like a bit of a pain, But ultimately, this was to the advantage of merchants, especially long distance merchants, because it meant that instead of having to lug around very large quantities of goods, instead of having to lug around bottles of liquor and sacks of rice and bundles of pellets and bags of cocoa beans and all this stuff, you could carry a much smaller quantity of gold or silver, which meant you could do a lot more trade and you could have higher profit margins. And so, specie quickly comes to establish itself as the main means of exchange. Everybody the world over comes to recognize that gold and silver is the ideal. Now, even it wasn't perfect. So, especially during the age of colonization, it was possible for huge windfalls of specie to happen. The Spanish Empire notoriously inflated their currency through the looting of the Inca Empire and the Aztecs. Both of those cultures had large metal deposits. See, the thing about gold and silver is that it's rare on a global scale, but that's because it's mostly concentrated in certain places. And it just so happened that the biggest silver mines in the world were all in Bolivia and Peru. So they end up getting their hands on so much silver from Peru that it winds up dramatically inflating the currency, and was ultimately was one of the causes of that empire going into decline. Much more dramatically, there's the story of Mansa Musa, the richest man in the world. Now, Musa ruled over Mali in, well, what would now be modern day Mali. He rolled over Mali in sub-Saharan Africa, Black Africa. And they had an abundance of gold, so much so that they didn't really use it as a currency themselves. But they were always trading with Muslim empires to the north. Places that did not have so much gold got a big ass hostile desert you have to cross to get there. And so it was a very profitable trade. Well, Mansa Musa himself was a Muslim, good Muslim. And like any good Muslim, that meant that he had two big expectations out of him, two obligations he had to fulfill for his religion. One of them being to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and the other being to perform acts of charity, what they call zakat. And so he sets off with his royal retinue for Mecca, and he sets off with wagons full of gold bars. Now, this is like a full-on treasure fleet. And along the way, he hands out gold, something that is relatively cheap to him, to peasants. He'd walk up to the home of an Egyptian and just give them gold that was worth several lifetimes of income. And as you can imagine, people couldn't believe their luck. What a hero! What an incredibly generous man to lift people from abject poverty to the heights of luxury. But the problem is he's not just handing out gold to a few people, he's handing out these gold bars to every Tom, Dick, and Harry that he runs across. And then those people go to the marketplace to spend it. Well, before long, the markets are glutted with gold. And what's the value of specie? The value of it is that it's rare. The value of it is that people can't easily make more of it, and that there isn't a lot of it, and that's compact. But when everybody's chucking gold bars around at the marketplace buying groceries, the value of a gold bar doesn't stick very high. And he actually ends up hyperinflating gold. Egypt's economy crashed and burned, and for a few decades, gold was worthless to them. Nobody would accept it as payment. Well, of course, that problem ended up resolving itself in the long run because Egypt was a part of the entire, old world economy. So a glut of gold in one area eventually gets spread out over the whole Eurasian landmass. Stuff like that could happen in the past. It could happen back when the world was still disunited, when there were still empires just over the horizon that nobody had met. It wouldn't happen today, except possibly through asteroid mining, because they claim that there's asteroids out there that are loaded with precious metals. So, whichever tech bro manages to mine one first, they might be the Mansa Musa of the modern day. But we also have a modern understanding of economics. I don't think people would allow that to happen. I forgot to tell you the story about these things. Um, this picture down here, that's cash. That's what the Chinese called their coins, cash. It's where you get the slang word cash from. The little holes in the middle of the coins. You see this in a lot of Asian currency. I've heard that it's for putting them on keychains. It's a rather nice idea. Keeps all your money together like you would use a clip with paper cash. Now, Specie gets introduced, and it mostly becomes important for long distance trade. It's kind of a pain in the ass to use in day to day life because, again, a very small amount of it, you actually run into the opposite problem. Instead of having to lug around large amounts of goods to make payments, you have to fuss over, very small amounts. So for most of history, what people are doing is they're actually combining all three. They're using specie more for long distance trade and savings, accumulate savings, using commodity currencies more for kind of everyday life. And then they're using a lot of barter in small interpersonal transactions. And you especially see barter and commodity currencies surviving in the countryside. Even as late as the late 1800s, honestly, in Appalachia, this continued all the way into the early 1900s. There were certain occupations that lived off of barter. Then, in particular, three ones I know of: schoolmarms, preachers, and country doctors. Because what all three of those had in common was they had a clientele that had a very inconsistent cash income. Most of the farmers in a given stretch of countryside didn't have much money, and their means of payment tended to be very unstable. So what people would do is they would largely keep their preacher, their doctor, and their school teacher alive through gifts. They would be allowed to live in a house, in a church. They would be given the board with their job, and they might get a little salary from the people of a county. But for the most part, they're being kept alive through donations. Folks in that area, they know that if they don't, if they don't feed the preacher, they're not going to have a preacher. And so you'd send little Johnny off to school with a fried chicken or a pie. If the country doctor comes by to heal someone, you give him a pig to take with him. It's up to him to find a use for it. And preachers would just travel around. They'd eat dinner every night with a different family. But you have a mixture of currencies all coexisting. Different currency types for different functions. That impersonal world, that village-like atmosphere, it didn't go away the moment civilization began. It just receded slowly, and it wasn't fully killed off until the Industrial Revolution. Now, much like how standardization of measures was introduced in order to help with the whole unit of account aspect of commodity currencies, coinage would be invented to help with the unit of account aspect of specie. So, for both convenience and prestige, currency issuing entities, which mostly meant rulers, but not always, would also standardize specie by creating coins. So I already mentioned pound sterling and shekels. Dollars were another one. That the dollar was a Spanish coin. The reason why we called our currency dollars instead of pounds when we won independence was that the American colonies always did a lot more trade with the Spanish Caribbean than they did with Britain. So there happened to be more dollars in circulation up here. But all of these words, they refer back to a unit of measure. And so the whole point of a coin was that that coin was supposed to have a specific amount of the precious metal in it. And thus you knew exactly what you were getting. Before coins, or in places that just didn't have coins, you would have to actually lug along a scale with you. Or if you're buying out of a shop, going to a merchant, they'd have a scale, which of course introduces some potential for cheating if it's been tampered with. But you would weigh, right? You'd weigh the specie, weigh that chunk, weigh that dust, and then you'd know, how much it was worth. This is a pain. This is tedious. So if you have an entity that has a unique stamp, essentially, could be counterfeited, could be forged, but it would take a bit of effort, and you could still kind of eyeball it and tell if it was off. If you have an entity that has some stamp that it's unmistakable that yes, they were the one that issued this coin, and you know that you can trust them, then you don't have to do all this busy work of weighing things yourself. And of course, the Grand Poobah in charge, he's going to put his own face on it. Why wouldn't he? He deserves to get credit for all the important work he does. Now, there were still ways to cheat with this. Both of these done by governments. One of them would be done by private counterfeiters. The first and more tacky and obvious way that you could try to cheat was through what was called coin clipping. You shave off the edges of a coin, you melt it down, and then you make a new coin from it. Of course, this would assume that you had to have the stamp to do it. Private counterfeiters, criminal counterfeiters, would have to go and steal themselves a stamp or forge the stamp. But, you all have probably seen the meme, right, of the chocolate bar. It shows people cutting off a chunk of the chocolate bar and then rearranging things. And they act like they have the original chocolate bar plus that extra piece. That's what you're doing with the coin. So you're trying to pass it off like it's the same coin. In practice, people can tell that it's been tampered with, right? Like over here in the upper right corner. This is obviously not a legitimate coin. It's obviously had shavings taken off of it. But if you're an average merchant, are you going to fuss about that? All you really care about is your own ability to buy things with it. And most people, in most times and places, are very conflict averse. They don't like to get into arguments with others. It's very tempting to just take the coin and then pass the problem down to someone else. And so this is how you inflate a currency that's completely physical. The value of the currency was based on the presumption that it has a certain amount of the metal in it, and now you're lying. It does not have the specified amount of metal. That's not a full dollar. That's not a full shekel. That's not a full dinar. But as long as people treat it like it's one, you can still use it. The other way people would cheat on currency was by doing what's called debasing it. So the coin is supposed to have a certain amount of specie in it. But what if we just put a little bit of trash in there and mixed it in? Would anybody notice? Would anybody notice if we had a little bit of worthless lead mixed into our 100% 50 million carat gold coin? No, they won't. And this is what governments, rulers would do. Usually, if you're a ruler, you have an incentive to to maintain your reputation, but oftentimes the government will get itself into a bit of a bind, usually meaning they get into a war that they're losing, and they're desperate to print up more cash. Well, in an age before you can literally print more money, what you'll do is you'll just start mixing in more trash metals, things like lead and tin, into your coins. People don't notice. Of course, there's always, people at the mint could always talk, but people won't notice until the money's already in circulation. And they call that debasing it. Because it's not a very base thing to do to, swindle your citizens. Now, of course, not all coins were so practical. And there was one culture that went a little bit overboard with this. They invented the concept of coinage, and then they went a little bit crazy. And that would be the island of Yap, located in Micronesia, the Pacific. See, the Yapese people, so named because they had been expelled from Japan for their habit of talking too much. They went from being Japanese to Yappies. They would use these things called rhinestones as their currency. Now, truth be told, every economics professor in the world is going to tell you this story, but usually they mislead you to believe that they are coins. They're not really coins. They look like coins. They're shaped like coins, but they were actually more like speculative art assets because rhinestones didn't come in standardized denominations. They would have a value based on the workmanship of it, size, the materials, most importantly, who had owned it in the past. If a particular, chief or shaman had owned the thing, then it would be more valuable. These things weren't really for like everyday purchases. As fun as it is to imagine someone, a woman lugging them around in her purse, or a person chucking them into a vending machine, they weren't doing that. They were more like super long-term investments. But they did genuinely use these things as payments for big purchases, property transactions. And there's a particular story. One time, hundreds of years ago, this one dude had, I think, sold some property, sold some land, and he's expecting payment. And the fellow he sold the land to, he gets his big rhinestone loaded up into a canoe, has his team of rowers, and they're moving it from island to island, paddling pretty hard. And then suddenly crack, the canoe sinks. Putting a very heavy, very tall stone into the little canoe was not a good idea. It couldn't handle the stress. And so down to Davy Jones' locker it goes, never to be seen again. Now, both parties are a bit upset about this. The seller of the land, he's expecting payment. He sold that land to get that rye stone. He expects that rye stone. At the same time, the purchaser wasn't too happy about the idea of having to pay all over again. And so they have their little legal quarrel, and they decide to go to Wise Village Elder. And Wise Village Elder, he ponders on this, consults the wisdom of their ancestors and all that. And finally, he comes to a solution. He tells them, well, we know where the stone is. Like the stone's at the bottom of the sea, but it sure ain't going anywhere. There's no risk anybody stealing it from the bottom of the ocean. So it's acceptable legal tender. And for the next several hundred years, for centuries after, the people of Yap continued to trade this big stone at the bottom of the ocean back and forth. They used it in property transactions, even though nobody could see it. And that, children, is the story of how the first NFT came into existence. In the next video, we'll see how we moved from coins, both small ones and big ones, on to paper currency, as we all know and love.